He controlled the city's underworld with a flick of his wrist. Men died when he nodded. But when the bell of a rundown roadside diner chimed at 2 a.m, the ruthless boss froze. There, wiping down a greasy counter in cheap, slip-resistant shoes, was the woman who had walked out on him 8 months ago, his ex-wife. And beneath her stained apron was a swollen, heavy belly, his heir growing in the slums. The king had found his runaway queen. The smell of stale fry oil and bleach was permanently baked into Clara's skin. It was 2:14 a.m. The neon sign outside the Silver Spoon Diner buzzed with a rhythmic, failing electric hum, flashing blood-red light across the cracked linoleum floor. Clara pressed the heel of her hand against her lower back, arching slightly to relieve the crushing pressure on her spine. She was 34 weeks pregnant. Her ankles, swollen and thick, pulsed against the tight confines of her cheap sneakers. The baby was awake, kicking furiously against her ribs, protesting the long hours on her feet. "Just an hour left, little one," Clara whispered, her voice rough from disuse. She grabbed a grey rag from a bucket of tepid sanitizing water, wringing it out with red, raw hands. The diner was a graveyard. 2 truckers slept in a booth by the back restrooms. A solitary cab driver sat at the far end of the counter, nursing a cold black coffee and staring blankly at a muted television screen. It was safe here, invisible. Clara had spent the last 8 months trading the sprawling, marble-floored estates of the Rossi syndicate for the quiet anonymity of the city's forgotten edges. She had walked away with nothing. No settlement, no alimony. Just a suitcase of clothes and the clothes on her back. Vincent had offered her millions. She knew the price of his money. It was tracking devices, offshore accounts tied to shell companies, and the constant, suffocating grip of his control. She had signed the divorce papers in a cold, sterile lawyer's office, handed over her diamond rings, and vanished. 3 weeks later, in the bathroom of a cheap motel, she had stared at 2 pink lines on a plastic stick. The bell above the glass door jingled. Clara didn't look up immediately. She wiped down the Formica counter, swiping a sticky ring of spilled syrup into her hand. The heavy thud of expensive leather shoes on the cheap floor registered in her mind. Not a trucker. Not a cop. Cold wind and the smell of rain swept into the diner, cutting through the stifling heat of the grill. "Booth in the back," a gruff male voice said. "Face the door." Clara's hand stopped moving. The rag slipped from her fingers, dropping back into the bucket with a quiet splash. The blood drained from her face, leaving her lightheaded. She knew that voice. It was Frankie. She forced herself to breathe, keeping her head down. Don't look up. Keep wiping. Maybe they wouldn't notice her. She was wearing a hideous yellow polyester uniform, her hair tied back in a messy, grease-streaked bun. She was 50 pounds heavier, stripped of the designer makeup and silk dresses she had once been forced to wear. She heard a chair scrape against the floor tiles. "Coffee! Black! Bring the whole pot!" Frankie barked toward the counter. Clara wiped her hands on her apron. The fabric stretched tight over her massive stomach. She turned around slowly, reaching for the glass coffee carafe sitting on the burner. Her hands shook violently. The glass rattled against the metal hot plate. She grabbed a thick ceramic mug. She didn't look towards the back booth. She stared straight at the coffee splashing black and bitter into the white cup. Then she felt it. The shift in the room. The sudden, suffocating drop in temperature. It was a physical weight pressing against the back of her neck. She turned around. Vincent was standing halfway between the booth and the counter. He wore a tailored charcoal overcoat, the shoulders dark with rain. Beneath it, a 3-piece suit cut from wool so fine it looked like liquid. His dark hair was slightly damp, pushed back from his forehead. His face, usually a mask of terrifying indifference, was slack. He was staring directly at her. More specifically, he was staring at her stomach. The silence in the diner stretched, pulling tight like piano wire. Even the cab driver seemed to sense the apex predator in the room, sinking lower over his cup. Frankie and Dino, standing near the booth, followed their boss's gaze. Frankie's jaw dropped. Dino cursed quietly under his breath. Vincent didn't blink. His dark eyes moved slowly up from the swollen bulge of her abdomen, past the grease stains on her apron, past the exhaustion etched deep into the circles under her eyes, until he finally met her gaze. Clara gripped the handle of the coffee pot until her knuckles turned white. She wanted to run. Her mind screamed at her to drop the glass and sprint out the back door into the alley, but her body was heavy, cumbersome, and exhausted. There was nowhere to run. Not from him. Vincent took a slow step forward. His eyes were entirely black. No warmth, no surprise, just a violent, consuming calculation. The king had been walking the board, and he had just found a piece that was supposed to have been removed from play entirely. Clara. Her name in his mouth sounded like a death sentence. The coffee pot slipped from Clara's grip. It hit the linoleum. The sharp, explosive crash of glass shattering echoed through the quiet diner. Boiling black coffee exploded across the floor, splashing against the hem of Clara's uniform and the toe of Vincent's polished leather shoe. Neither of them looked down. "Sir, you can't be back here!" A voice squeaked from the kitchen pass. Mr. Henderson, the night manager, poked his head out, clutching a spatula. "The counter is closed for cleaning." Vincent didn't even turn his head. He raised one gloved hand, a fraction of an inch. Frankie stepped forward, sliding his hand inside his jacket. He looked at the manager. "Go back to the grill, buddy, and stay there." Mr. Henderson saw the shape under the jacket. He saw the cold deadness in Frankie's eyes. He vanished back into the kitchen without another word. Vincent stepped into the puddle of coffee. Shards of glass crunched under his weight. He stopped on the other side of the counter, mere inches from Clara. He was close enough now that she could smell the rain on his coat, the expensive cedar cologne, and the metallic tang of gunpowder. He had been working. "You're supposed to be in Geneva," Vincent said. His voice was low, smooth, and dangerously calm. It was the voice he used right before he broke someone. Clara took a half step back. Her spine hit the metal ledge of the pie display case. She crossed her arms over her stomach in a purely instinctual gesture of protection. "Geneva is expensive. I sent $3 million to a Swiss account in your name," he stated, his eyes locked on her hands guarding her belly. "I didn't touch it. I didn't want it." Vincent's jaw tightened. A small muscle ticked beneath his left ear. He leaned forward, resting his hands flat on the sticky countertop. He looked at her hands, raw and cracked from bleach. He looked at her shoes. Then his gaze dropped back to her stomach. The baby chose that exact moment to kick. A sharp, visible roll that distorted the fabric of the cheap yellow apron. Vincent froze. He stopped breathing. For a fleeting, fractured second, the terrifying boss of the Rossi family vanished, replaced by a man struck by lightning. He stared at the movement beneath the fabric. "How far along?" he asked. The calmness was cracking. "It's none of your business." Clara shot back, her voice shaking but her chin raised. "We're divorced, Vincent. The papers are signed. You have no right to be here. You have no right to ask me questions." Vincent's eyes snapped up to hers. The shock was gone. The cold fury was back. "Do the math, Clara," he said softly. "You left 8 months and 12 days ago." He gestured sharply to her stomach. "That is not a fresh development. You were pregnant when you left. Or you got pregnant the day before you walked out the door. It's not yours." The lie tasted like ash in her mouth. It was pathetic, and they both knew it. There had been no one else. Not during their marriage, and certainly not in the grueling, desperate months since. Vincent didn't even dignify the lie with a response. He simply stared at her, dissecting her. "You lived in a basement," he observed, his voice devoid of inflection. "You smell like mildew and cheap soap. You are working the graveyard shift in a diner that serves truck drivers and junkies. You have no car. You have no security. I have freedom," she snapped. You have a death wish, he corrected. He stood up straight. Get your coat. Panic flared in Clara's chest. No, I'm working. My shift ends at 3. Your shift ended the second I walked through that door, Vincent said. He looked over his shoulder. Frankie, find the manager. Pay him for the damage and tell him Clara is resigning. You can't do this! Clara's voice pitched up, breaking the quiet of the diner. The cab driver at the end of the counter finally realized the danger, tossed a $5 bill on the counter, and bolted out the front door. I am doing it, Vincent said. He walked around the edge of the counter, stepping into the staff area. It was a blatant violation of space. The kitchen felt instantly claustrophobic. His sheer physical presence consumed the air. Clara backed away, her hand grasping blindly behind her, until she found a heavy metal serving spoon. It was a laughable weapon against a man who carried a custom Glock under his arm, but she held it tight. Don't come any closer, she warned. I'll scream. I'll call the cops. Vincent stopped. A bitter, cynical smile touched the corners of his mouth. The cops in this district work for me, Clara. You know that. And screaming will only upset the child. He looked at the spoon in her hand. Then he looked at her eyes. You hid my child from me, he said. The volume of his voice didn't rise, but the intensity of it physically pushed her back. You stole my blood. You put my heir in a grease pit on the edge of the city where any rival with a grudge could have found you. Do you have any idea what would happen if the Moretti family found out my pregnant ex-wife was slinging hash on Highway 9? They wouldn't have found out, Clara yelled, tears of frustration finally pricking her eyes. Because I was dead to you. You made sure everyone knew I was gone. You are carrying a Rossi. He pointed a finger at the ground. Right here. In this filth. You put my child in danger. I put your child out of reach, she fired back, breathing heavily. Her back throbbed with a vicious spike of pain. I didn't want him raised in a fortress. I didn't want him learning to check under cars for bombs. I wanted a normal life for him. There is no normal life for us, Clara. Vincent reached out, moving too fast for her heavy body to react. He gripped her wrist. Not hard enough to bruise, but firm enough to paralyze her. He took the spoon from her trembling fingers and dropped it on the counter. Coat, now. Clara didn't move. She stared at his hand locked around her wrist. The familiar warmth of his skin against hers sent a sickening wave of nostalgia and terror through her system. Vincent, please, she whispered, the fight suddenly draining out of her. Exhaustion hit her like a physical blow. Her legs trembled. I can't go back to that house. I can't live like a ghost in a museum again. Don't make me do this. For a fraction of a second, his grip loosened. His dark eyes flicked across her face, taking in the hollows of her cheeks, the sheer, crushing fatigue she was carrying. When they were married, she had been radiant, draped in silk, dripping in jewels, protected by an army of men. Now she looked like a broken bird. He had let her go because she had begged him. She had cried on the marble floor of his study, telling him his world was rotting her soul. He had let her leave because he thought his money would keep her safe, far away from the blood of his business. He had been wrong. You aren't going back to the estate, Vincent said flatly. You're coming to the penthouse. It's secure. He let go of her wrist and took her by the elbow, pulling her gently but unstoppably toward the back room. My things, Clara protested, stumbling slightly as she tried to keep up with his long strides. I'll buy you new things. I have a life here. You have a survival strategy. Vincent corrected coldly. And a poor one. Where is your locker? They entered the cramped, foul-smelling break room. Clara pointed numbly to a dented grey metal locker in the corner. Vincent opened it. Inside hung a threadbare grey wool coat she had bought at a thrift store. At the bottom sat a cheap canvas tote bag. Vincent stared at the coat. Disgust rippled across his features. He reached in, grabbed it by the collar, and tossed it into the trash can next to the lockers. Hey! Clara lunged forward, but her belly hit his arm, stopping her short. Before she could protest further, Vincent was shrugging out of his own custom-tailored charcoal overcoat. The residual warmth of his body clung to the silk lining. He stepped behind her and draped the heavy wool over her shoulders. It swamped her, falling past her knees, smelling intoxicatingly of him. He didn't bother with the canvas bag. "Let's go," he said, turning back toward the diner floor. Frankie was waiting by the front door. He had a stack of $100 bills resting on the cash register. Mr. Henderson was nowhere to be seen. Clara walked in a daze, the heavy coat weighing her down. She paused at the door, looking back at the bucket of dirty water, the shattered glass of the coffee pot, the spilled black liquid on the floor. Her miserable, safe, exhausting life, over in the span of 5 minutes. Vincent didn't look back. He opened the glass door, stepping out into the freezing rain. A black armored SUV sat idling by the curb, headlights cutting through the downpour. Dino was holding an umbrella, his eyes constantly scanning the empty highway and the dark tree line beyond the diner's parking lot. Vincent kept a firm hand on the small of Clara's back, guiding her through the rain. The touch burned through the wool of the coat. Dino opened the heavy, reinforced rear door. Clara climbed in clumsily, hauling her heavy frame up into the soft, immaculate black leather interior. The contrast from the hard plastic chairs of the diner was jarring. It was the scent of wealth, power, and danger. Vincent slid in next to her. The door slammed shut with a heavy, airtight thud that locked out the sound of the rain. The silence inside the cabin was total. "Drive," Vincent ordered the driver. The SUV pulled away smoothly, leaving the flickering neon sign of the Silver Spoon behind in the rearview mirror. Clara huddled against the passenger door, pulling Vincent's coat tighter around herself. She stared out the tinted window at the passing dark trees. Her heart was beating frantically. She had spent 8 months looking over her shoulder, terrified he would find her. Now that he had, the reality was worse than the nightmare. She was trapped. Again. But this time, she wasn't just risking herself. She pressed a hand to the side of her stomach. The baby had finally settled down, lulled by the smooth motion of the expensive vehicle. Vincent sat rigidly on his side of the bench seat. He didn't look at her. He stared straight ahead at the partition separating them from the driver. "When is the due date?" he asked. The question hung in the quiet air, a demand rather than a request. Clara kept her eyes on the window. 5 weeks, Vincent calculated silently. "You haven't seen a proper doctor." "I go to a free clinic," she said defensively. "They have an ultrasound machine. He's fine." The word hung in the air. Vincent turned his head slowly to look at her. Even in the dim light of the passing street lamps, Clara could see the shift in his expression. The ruthless, calculating mob boss fractured again, revealing something raw, possessive, and terrifyingly human. "A son!" The words were barely a whisper, slipping from his lips like a prayer and a threat all at once. Clara swallowed hard, closing her eyes. She had given him the one piece of ammunition he needed to never, ever let her go again. "Yes," she whispered back. Vincent reached across the wide expanse of the leather seat. Clara tensed, expecting him to grab her wrist again, or perhaps cup her chin to force her to look at him. But his hand bypassed her face, bypassing her arms. His large, calloused hand rested gently, but with absolute ownership directly on the center of her swollen stomach. The heat of his palm seared through the cheap polyester of her uniform. Clara gasped softly, her breath catching in her throat. She tried to pull back, to press herself deeper into the door, but his hand followed, relentless. "Mine," Vincent said softly. He wasn't talking to her. He was talking to the child hidden beneath her skin. "And no one will ever hide you from me again." The private elevator to the penthouse did not hum. It didn't rattle or shake like the freight lift at the diner. It moved with a silent, terrifying efficiency, swallowing the floors of the city in a matter of seconds. Clara stood in the back corner of the brushed steel box, leaning heavily against the mirrored wall. Her legs felt like lead. The adrenaline that had spiked in the diner was evaporating, leaving behind a bone-deep, hollow exhaustion. She kept her arms wrapped around Vincent's heavy wool coat, burying her face in the collar to block out the sharp, sterile scent of ozone in the elevator. Vincent stood perfectly still in the center of the car. He watched her reflection in the steel doors. He noted the way her knees trembled. He saw the grey pallor of her skin, completely devoid of the flush of health she'd carried when she was his wife. "You're pale," he stated. It wasn't a question of concern, it was an assessment of a failing asset. "I've been standing on concrete for 9 hours. Clara replied, not looking up. "I'm pregnant, not dying." "That is a matter of perspective." The doors slid open. Total suffocating silence greeted them. The penthouse was a fortress suspended 80 stories above the street. The walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a panoramic view of the storm swallowing the city, but the glass was ballistic, 2 inches thick, bulletproof, bomb-resistant, and entirely soundproof. The floors were poured concrete, polished to a dark, mirror-like finish, accented by stark, brutalist leather furniture. It felt less like a home and more like a high-altitude bunker. Sit," Vincent ordered, pointing to a massive charcoal sofa that anchored the center of the living room. Clara didn't argue. Her body wouldn't let her. She shuffled forward, her cheap, grease-stained sneakers squeaking pathetically against the floorless floor. She sank into the deep cushions, sinking so low that her knees rode up awkwardly around her swollen stomach. She winced, pressing a hand to her lower back. Vincent unbuttoned his suit jacket. He didn't sit. He paced. He walked to a sleek black console against the far wall, poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a crystal glass, and downed it in a single motion. The heavy front doors of the penthouse opened. Frankie stepped in, immediately followed by a slight, grey-haired man carrying a battered leather medical bag. "Dr. Keller," Vincent said, setting the empty glass down with a sharp clink. "Thank you for coming on short notice." Dr. Keller didn't look tired, despite the 3 a.m. call. He was the syndicate's private physician, a man well compensated to ignore gunshot wounds, erratic hours, and the identities of his patients. "Vincent, where is the patient?" Vincent nodded toward the sofa. Keller walked over, his professional mask slipping for just a fraction of a second when he saw Clara. He remembered her from a year ago, draped in diamonds at a syndicate gala, holding court with a terrifying, radiant grace. Now she looked like a refugee. "Mrs. Rossi?" Keller said softly, opening his bag. "It's just Clara," she muttered, letting her head fall back against the leather. "And I don't need a doctor. I need sleep." "Humor me," Keller said, pulling out a blood pressure cuff. He wrapped it around her bare arm. The fabric of her diner uniform rode up, exposing skin that was pale and dotted with faint bruises from bumping into kitchen counters. Vincent stood 10 feet away, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes burning holes into the doctor's hands. The cuff hissed as it inflated. Keller watched the gauge, his brow furrowing slightly. He released the air, took his stethoscope, and placed it against her back, instructing her to breathe. Then he moved to her stomach. Clara stiffened, her hands instinctively moving to guard her belly. "It's all right," Keller murmured, just checking the fetal heart rate. He pressed a cold Doppler monitor against her stomach. A beat of static filled the quiet room, followed by a rapid, rhythmic, galloping sound. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. Vincent stopped breathing. His rigid posture broke. He took 2 slow steps toward the couch, his eyes wide, fixated on the small plastic device in the doctor's hand. The sound of the heartbeat was deafening in the silent penthouse. It was fast. It was strong. It was undeniable proof of life. "Heart rate is strong, 150 beats per minute," Dr. Keller said, offering a tight smile. He packed the device away. The room plunged back into silence. Keller stood up and turned to Vincent. He didn't mince words. The baby is fine. She is not. Her blood pressure is dangerously high. She is severely malnourished, dehydrated, and carrying entirely too much tension in her lumbar spine. If she continues on her feet, she will go into premature labor, and given her current physical state, I cannot guarantee her body will survive the trauma. Vincent's jaw locked. The muscles in his neck strained against his collar. He looked at Clara, his eyes dark with a violent, possessive fury. "Frankie!" Vincent snapped. Frankie stepped forward from the shadows near the door. "Yeah, boss. Go to the diner. Burn it." Clara jerked upright, panic seizing her chest. "Vincent, no! There are innocent people there. Mr. Henderson." "I don't care about Mr. Henderson!" Vincent roared, the sheer volume of his voice cracking the glass-like silence of the room. He pointed a finger at her. "You risked my son for a minimum wage job. You starved yourself to hide from me. I starved because you froze my real accounts!" Clara yelled back, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "I had nothing!" Vincent stepped into her space, leaning over the couch until he was inches from her face. "You had me. You had an empire. You chose a slum." He turned back to his capo. "Frankie, buy the diner. Fire everyone. Then tear the building down to the dirt. If she tries to go back, I want there to be nothing left to return to." When Clara woke, she didn't know what time it was, or what day. The heavy blackout curtains of the master bedroom were drawn shut, sealing the room in total darkness. She was lying on a mattress that felt like a cloud, wrapped in Egyptian cotton sheets that cost more than her entire yearly salary at the diner. Her cheap, grease-stained uniform was gone. Someone, a maid most likely, summoned in the dead of night, had bathed her and dressed her in a loose silk slip. She turned her head. A small lamp clicked on in the corner of the room. Vincent was sitting in a winged armchair, bathed in the low, amber light. He had finally taken off his tie, and the top 2 buttons of his shirt were undone. He was holding a tablet, the harsh blue glow illuminating the deep, bruised circles under his eyes. He hadn't slept. He had just sat there, watching the bed, guarding the cage. "Thirsty?" he asked. His voice was gravelly, stripped of the booming authority from the night before. Clara nodded slowly, pushing herself up against the massive headboard. Every joint in her body ached, but the crushing fatigue was gone. She must have slept for 10 hours. Vincent set the tablet down. He poured a glass of ice water from a silver pitcher on the nightstand and handed it to her. Their fingers brushed. His were freezing. Hers were burning with the elevated body heat of the 3rd trimester. Clara drank the water greedily, her throat dry and raspy. When she lowered the glass, she found him staring at her belly again. The silk slip clung to the massive curve of it. "You look—" Vincent started, then stopped. The ruthless boss of the underworld was struggling to find a word that wouldn't sound like a weakness. "You look like a mother." "I am a mother," Clara said quietly. "Or I will be. Soon." Vincent leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together. "Why didn't you tell me, Clara? When you handed me those papers in the lawyer's office, why didn't you say something? Would you have let me go?" The silence that followed was heavy and thick. Vincent looked at the floor, his jaw tightening. "No," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "I would have burned the city to ash before I let you walk out that door with my child. That is exactly why I didn't tell you," Clara said, her voice trembling but resolute. She set the glass down. "Look around you, Vincent. Look at this room." Vincent looked up. "It's secure. The glass can stop a .50 caliber round. The doors require biometric clearance. You are perfectly safe." "I am perfectly trapped!" Clara fired back, her frustration boiling over. "It's a vault! You lock your money in vaults, you lock your guns in vaults. I am not property, Vincent, and neither is this baby. You think I enjoy the vault?" Vincent stood up, his sudden movement restless, caged. He paced to the window and tore back the heavy curtain. Grey, washed-out daylight flooded the room. The city stretched out below them, sprawling and insignificant. "You think I want to live behind armor plating?" he asked, pointing down at the streets. "There is a war out there, Clara. The Falcone Syndicate is bleeding my territory dry in the south. My own lieutenants are getting hungry. Weakness is an invitation for a bullet. You think you were living a noble, independent life in that diner? You were a sitting duck. If the Falcones had found you—" He stopped, closing his eyes, suppressing a physical shudder. The thought of it was acid in his veins. "They didn't find me," Clara argued. "I was a nobody. I was a ghost. No one looks twice at a pregnant waitress in a bad part of town." "I look twice," Vincent said, turning to face her. His eyes were entirely black, devoid of light. "And if I can find you, they can find you. And they wouldn't have brought you a doctor, Clara. They would have cut that child out of you to send me a message and left you to bleed to death on the linoleum." Clara flinched, her hands instinctively flying to her stomach. The brutal, unfiltered reality of his words struck her like a physical blow. She hated him for saying it, but she hated it more because she knew it was true. "I couldn't raise him in the estate," Clara whispered, the fight suddenly draining out of her. She looked down at her hands, still red and raw from the harsh cleaning chemicals. "I remember what it was like. The bodyguards at the grocery store, the sweeps of the cars for explosives, the men bleeding on the carpets in the middle of the night. I watched you lose pieces of your soul to this business, Vincent. I watched you turn into stone." She looked up, meeting his cold, dark eyes. "I couldn't let my son watch his father turn into a monster." Vincent stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. He didn't defend himself. He didn't deny it. He simply accepted the verdict of his ex-wife with a cold, terrifying grace. "I am a monster," Vincent agreed softly. He walked back to the bed, leaning over her, his presence utterly overwhelming. "But I am the monster that keeps the other monsters away. And right now, that is exactly what you need." The illusion of domestic peace, however fraught and bitter it was, shattered just past noon. Clara was sitting at the massive marble island in the kitchen, forcing down a bowl of fresh fruit and steel-cut oats that the chef had prepared. Vincent sat across from her, drinking black coffee, reading reports on his tablet. It was almost a facsimile of their old married life, if one ignored the heavy silence and the sheer, unspoken terror hanging in the air. The biometric lock on the front door chimed. Frankie walked in. He didn't bother knocking. His face was grim, his suit jacket open, revealing the shoulder holster strapped to his chest. He stopped at the edge of the kitchen, his eyes darting briefly to Clara before locking onto Vincent. "Boss, we got a problem?" Vincent didn't look up from his screen. "Speak." "It's about the diner," Frankie said, his voice dropping an octave. "I went down there with a crew this morning to handle the buyout like you asked. The place was taped off. Cops everywhere." Vincent's finger stopped swiping on the glass. He slowly raised his head. The temperature in the room plummeted. "Why?" "A hit?" Frankie said, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "Professional job. Walked in around 5 a.m. right after we left. Shot up the back booths, torched the kitchen, left a message painted on the wall." Clara's spoon slipped from her fingers, clattering loudly against the marble bowl. Her heart slammed against her ribs. "Who?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Who was hurt?" "Was Mr. Henderson?" Frankie didn't answer her. He looked at Vincent. "Who?" Vincent demanded, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "The Falcone crew?" Frankie confirmed. They didn't find who they were looking for, so they made a mess. Henderson caught 2 in the chest. He's dead. The dishwasher is in critical. Clara clamped a hand over her mouth, a violently sick feeling rising in her throat. 5 a.m., 3 hours after Vincent had dragged her out. If she had fought him harder, If she had managed to slip out the back door and hide in the storeroom, she would be dead, and her baby would be dead. Vincent stood up slowly. He didn't look at Clara. His face was completely blank, devoid of any human emotion. The man who had gently touched her stomach in the SUV, the man who had ordered her a doctor, was gone. The boss of the Rossi syndicate had taken his place. They were looking for her, Vincent stated. It wasn't a question. Word must have leaked that you were moving around the South Side last night, Frankie said. They put two and two together. They know you pulled someone out of that diner. Do they know who? Not yet, Frankie replied. But they have guys sniffing around the hospitals, looking for pregnant women checking in. They know she was heavy with child. Vincent walked around the kitchen island. His movements were predatory, perfectly calculated. He grabbed his suit jacket off the back of a chair and slid his arms into the sleeves. Find the trigger men, Vincent ordered, adjusting his cuffs. I don't care how deep into Falcone territory you have to dig. Dig them out. I want them brought to the meatpacking plant on 4th Street. And Falcone? Frankie asked. Leave the old man for now. Take his lieutenants. Take their teeth, break their knees, and leave their bodies in the trunks of their own cars parked outside Falcone's estate. Vincent's voice was utterly devoid of mercy. It was an administrative order, a ledger being balanced in blood. Clara sat frozen on the stool. She watched him give the orders, watching the casual way he commanded torture and murder. The reality of his world, the world she had desperately fled, was suddenly, violently crashing through the ballistic glass of the penthouse. Vincent turned to her. He saw the horror in her eyes, the trembling of her hands resting on her swollen stomach. Finish your food, he said coldly. You're going to kill them, Clara whispered. I am going to butcher them, Vincent corrected, stepping closer to her. He braced his hands on the marble counter, trapping her in his shadow. Because they came for my son. They came for you. And the only language men like Falcone understand is absolute, disproportionate violence. It's just blood, Clara cried, tears spilling hot down her cheeks. It's always just blood with you. It never ends. It ends when they are all dead, Vincent said softly. He reached out, his thumb gently wiping a tear from her cheek. The touch was brutally tender, a stark contrast to the horrific orders he had just given. You wanted to live in the real world, Clara? This is the real world. You are my wife. You are carrying my heir. There is no anonymity for you. There is only survival. He pulled his hand back, the warmth of his touch lingering on her skin like a brand. Do not leave this penthouse, he commanded, looking at Frankie to ensure the capo heard the implicit threat. If she tries to run, lock her in a room and throw away the key. Vincent turned and walked out the door, the heavy steel locks engaging with a definitive, inescapable click behind him. Clara was left alone in the massive kitchen, the silence of the fortress ringing in her ears. She pressed both hands to her stomach, feeling the baby kick against her palms. The monster had gone to war to protect them. She was safe, and she had never been more terrified in her life. The penthouse was a tomb of high-end luxury. For 3 days, Clara did not see the sun. The storm system that had dragged her back into Vincent's world stalled over the city, battering the ballistic glass with sheets of grey rain. She paced the length of the living room, her cheap sneakers replaced by soft woolen slippers that offered zero comfort to her swelling ankles. She walked from the kitchen island to the massive leather sofa, then to the heavy oak double doors that led to the private elevator. Every time she neared the doors, 2 heavily armed guards, men she didn't recognize, men with flat, dead eyes, shifted their weight. She was a prisoner, a highly valued, fiercely protected prisoner. It was 4:12 a.m. on the 4th day when the elevator chimed. Clara froze by the window, wrapping her arms protectively around her stomach. The heavy doors slid open. Vincent walked in. He looked nothing like the immaculate, tailored king who had stood in the diner. He moved with a heavy, dragging limp. His suit jacket was gone. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, the sleeves rolled up past his elbows. The fabric of his shirt was soaked in blood. It wasn't a fine mist or a stray splatter. The front of his shirt was saturated, drying into a stiff, rusty brown armor. His knuckles were raw, the skin split and swollen. He stopped in the middle of the foyer, breathing heavily, his head bowed. He looked at his hands, watching a fresh drop of crimson slip from his pinky finger to dot the immaculate polished concrete floor. Clara couldn't move. The smell hit her a second later, a thick metallic stench of copper, sweat, and fear. Vincent finally looked up. His eyes were hollowed out, dark pits of exhaustion. He saw her standing by the glass, pale and trembling. "Go back to bed, Clara," he rasped. His voice sounded like it had been dragged over broken glass. He didn't walk toward her. He walked toward the guest bathroom down the hall, purposefully keeping his distance, treating himself like a contagion. Clara stood rooted to the spot. Her mind screamed at her to run to the bedroom, to lock the door, to hide from the reality of what this man did in the dark. She closed her eyes. She saw the quiet, kind face of Mr. Henderson, the diner manager who had sneaked her extra slices of pie. Dead. Because of her. She opened her eyes, pushing herself away from the window. Her back screamed in protest as she followed the trail of blood down the hallway. The bathroom door was open. Vincent was leaning over the marble vanity. The water was running on full blast. He was scrubbing his hands with a stiff bristled brush, the water turning a violent pink as it circled the drain. He wasn't just washing, he was punishing the skin, scraping at it until his own knuckles bled anew. Clara stepped into the doorway. The harsh fluorescent light above the mirror cast deep, skeletal shadows across his face. "You're going to tear the skin off," she said softly. Vincent stiffened. He didn't turn around. "I told you to go to bed,"